Chapter 1. St. Mary Mead's Charming. Welcome to Warm Pages, where the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, with its ivy-clad walls and polished brass door-knockers, presents a tableau so charming, one could almost believe that danger, real danger, has no place here. On market day, as it has for generations, the square in the centre of the village transformed. Cobblestones beneath polished shoes, striped awnings dancing gently in the breeze, and the scent of fresh bread curling through the air, mingling with the sharper tang of apples and aged cheese. Children's laughter, short, bright, unthinking, rang out near the fountain, while elderly men exchanged politics over lukewarm tea and wives whispered over baskets of plums. All of it unchanged, or at least appearing to be. The events of the past week had shaken this carefully ordered world. A sudden collapse behind the baker's stall, the unmistakable scent of almonds on the air, too faint for most, but not for one woman. There was no screaming, no dramatic fall, only a stillness that followed. A teacup, half finished, a crowd gathered. The ordinary morning undone by an unspoken act. The doctor had declared it poison, cyanide. Miss Marple, who had once read far too many chemistry textbooks for a woman who never set foot in a laboratory, had known even before he'd spoken. But that was only the beginning. Mrs. Thornbury was gone, her cinnamon buns untouched that morning, her ledger hastily concealed beneath the boards of her stall. A ledger Miss Marple now possessed. A ledger filled not with baking orders, but with cryptic codes and unexplained initials, evidence of something none in the village had dared name aloud. The market had not closed. St. Mary Mead, even in grief, demanded rhythm. Produce was still weighed, tea still poured, but laughter had thinned, and eyes lingered longer than usual. Mr. Jameson, the greengrocer once so cheerful, now fumbled with scales and avoided looking anyone in the face. Tom Fletcher, the young man who had once delivered eggs with a grin, now flinched at the clang of a dropped coin, and from windows above the stalls, curtains shifted, just slightly when Miss Marple passed by. There were secrets in the stalls now, the kind that lived in between ledger lines, in over-rehearsed alibis, in the silence that baked itself into loaves. Miss Marple knew, she always knew, not through force but observation. The quiet intellect of a village sleuth whose eyes missed nothing, whose questions were simple, but whose conclusions were surgical. She had seen the scratch marks near Tom's stall. She had seen the message scorched into its wood, silence or else. Chapter 2. The First Investigation. There is something about market day that lends an air of familiarity to disorder, as though the clatter of wooden crates and the shouts over strawberries might soften any blow, even one delivered in porcelain and poisoned silence. But on that particular morning, with the taste of tragedy still clinging to the cobbles, familiarity had become camouflage. The square had been cordoned with polite authority by Inspector Slack, a man whose competence was matched only by his distaste for complication. Routine, he had declared. We treat it like any other sudden collapse until proven otherwise. The words had barely cooled on the air before the doctor confirmed what Miss Marple had quietly deduced the moment her nostrils had flared at that unmistakable trace, the bitter almond scent of cyanide. No one said the word aloud. Not Slack, nor the constable who arrived with a rusted clipboard and questions in biro. But the mood had shifted. Baskets were lowered, voices dropped. Mrs. Thornbury's lifeless form had been removed, and the tea she never finished remained untouched, steaming slightly under the veiled sun. The cup itself would be examined later, along with the sugar bowl, though only one of them had moved since it was last touched. Miss Marple had seen it all. Not the act, no, but the aftermath, the position of each object, the faces of the surrounding vendors. The sugar bowl had been adjusted. A single spoon rested atop a napkin, not inside the cup as Mrs. Thornbury preferred, and beneath the counter, barely visible, was a corner of leather binding protruding where it shouldn't have. A secret ledger, perhaps, or simply an accounting book, but no one else noticed. No one else, after all, looked for such things. Inspector Slack focused instead on the people. Mr. Jameson, the greengrocer, now perspiring despite the moderate weather, fingers trembling over the scale's counterweight. He had spoken too quickly when asked about his whereabouts that morning. "I was here, always am." Every week, he'd stammered, eyes flicking briefly to the bakery stall, then back to Slack's notebook. His discomfort was obvious, but was it guilt, or simply fear of appearing guilty? Miss Marple said nothing, yet she observed everything. Tom Fletcher, by contrast, had retreated into himself entirely. He offered only short, blunt answers. Yes, no, maybe, I think so, each more strained than the last. His gaze darted too often, not just to the constable, but to Morrison, the colonel's silent aide, who now loitered by the church gate, with hands behind his back and the look of a man awaiting a signal. Tom was watching him closely, too closely. Inspector Slack took notes, asked questions, and thanked them each for their cooperation. Yet he missed the hidden clue, the peculiar uniformity of answers, the eagerness of vendors to speak in the same phrases. She took her tea sweet, always opened at 7 sharp, hadn't a cross word with anyone. Too perfect, too clean, that was the clue, or rather, the absence of imperfection was the clue. And while Slack scribbled statements, Miss Marple bent quietly behind Mrs. Thornbury's stall under the pretense of retrieving her dropped handkerchief. Her fingers brushed the worn leather spine she had earlier noticed. She did not pull it free, not yet, but she felt the weight of it, its potential as both proof and provocation. It was a dark conspiracy, not yet proven but outlined in the faces of those who would not meet her eyes. And among them, Mr. Jameson, with hands that trembled not from grief but from restraint, perhaps holding back a violent reaction, or perhaps the truth. Miss Marple would know soon enough. The vague alibis, the shadow of suspicion, the tea left unfinished, all pointed to a pattern, and as always, in a village of such routine precision, it was the pattern that mattered most. Nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was. By midday, the square had begun to settle, but only in the way a surface settles after the stone has sunk, the ripples slow to fade, and the depth beneath left thoroughly disturbed. Inspector Slack had completed his first round of interrogation, dutiful and methodical. His report would soon read like all his others: cause of incident, approximate time, list of witnesses, but even he, with his distaste for guesswork, had begun to frown at his own notes. Too many gaps, too much agreement. It was, in a word, neat. And murder, as Miss Marple once quietly said over a tray of scones, was never neat, not truly. Tom Fletcher had returned briefly to his stall, pale and still, shoulders hunched. He had rearranged his baskets more out of muscle memory than intention, but the moment Morrison passed by, unblinking, silent, gloves tucked beneath his arm, Tom dropped a jar of honey, offered no apology, and left again, citing a headache. That was the missing piece. Chapter 3. Suspicions and Strange Behaviour. In every village there is a moment, a very particular moment, when the line between discomfort and suspicion fades, when glances cease to be merely curious and begin instead to measure risk, when silence thickens, not from politeness, but because someone, somewhere, knows too much. That moment had come to St. Mary Mead. It arrived not with a shout or a verdict, but in the narrowing of eyes at the corner of the greengrocer's stall, where Mr. Jameson and young Tom Fletcher stood close, their voices just barely contained beneath the rustle of brown paper and the polite murmur of market exchange. Miss Marple had not needed to eavesdrop. She had seen enough in their posture. Jameson's jaw set tightly, his fingers flexing on the edge of a crate, Tom's shoulders tense, feet turned as though ready to bolt. No coins were exchanged, no pleasantries, just a few clipped words. Then Tom walked away, pale and rigid, without even pretending to sell a single egg that day. And Jameson, red in the face, muttered something under his breath that sounded very much like regret. Miss Marple said nothing, but the image fixed itself in her mind. She had learned, over many years, that such moments were rarely meaningless. There was rage there, not the loud theatrical kind, but the quiet, dangerous kind that lingers after a brutal betrayal. Something had been exposed too early or to the wrong person, and now the village's carefully maintained rhythm had missed a step. She followed her routine, of course, just as they expected. A purchase here, a comment there. But while she inquired about marmalade, she was watching, and what she saw disturbed her. Tom flinched when the vendors clustered too near. Not from shyness, no, he had never been shy. It was a reflex, an unconscious bracing of the shoulders, as though awaiting a blow. And the others, they had changed too. They now spoke with a peculiar uniformity, phrases repeated verbatim, smiles just a second too long, eyes that didn't match their voices. She had heard it in 3 stalls that morning. Poor Mrs. Thornbury, always so healthy, wasn't she? Word for word, repeated, practiced, rehearsed. There was a performance underway, and St. Mary Mead had become its stage. Miss Marple noted inconsistencies, small but telling. Mr. Jameson's claim to have opened his stall at 7 clashed with Mrs. Deverell's account, which placed him arriving after the bell. A crate of oranges had been marked, received Tuesday, though the delivery man had not come until Wednesday. Receipts, when inspected, bore identical handwriting. 3 vendors, 3 signatures, all with the same looped R, and the sugar bowl, the one previously missing, had now returned to the bakery stall, but had been placed on the left side of the tray, not the right, where Mrs. Thornbury always set it, moved again. By whose hand? And for what purpose? There was a sense now, not of danger spoken aloud, but of constraint. The square felt tighter, the space between stalls narrower, the sun somehow more reluctant to reach the corners. Conversations dropped when Miss Marple approached, then resumed in tones that were too loud, too deliberately cheerful. She was no longer merely the village sleuth. She was an audience no one wanted, but she watched all the same, and as she passed Tom once more, his eyes darting toward her, away again, she caught a flicker of apology, or perhaps warning. She wasn't yet sure. But what she did know was this: a trail of lies had been laid, and each step along it led deeper into something carefully constructed, and now slowly coming apart. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. One of the many advantages of being thought harmless is that people rarely guard their words around you, and Miss Marple, who knew this better than most, had perfected the art of appearing absorbed in a pot of dahlias while listening very closely to conversations not meant for her. That afternoon, as she lingered behind the curtain rack outside Mrs. Fleet's haberdashery, ostensibly to inspect a bolt of faded paisley, she heard the unmistakable timbre of Mr. Jameson's voice, low and quick, speaking not to Tom this time, but to a woman whose back remained turned. Miss Marple recognized the stance immediately. Mrs. Culthorpe, the jam seller, known more for her gooseberry preserves than for discretion. "We agreed on the same story," Jameson hissed. "She wasn't supposed to ask about deliveries. If anyone checks the times, it falls apart. We stick to it," Mrs. Culthorpe replied flatly. "There's too much at stake now, and he's already shown he can't be trusted." They parted without looking at one another. No money changed hands, no threats were made. It was, Miss Marple thought, a perfect exchange, because it had been practiced. That was the deadly deception, not the poison in the teacup, not even the ledger. The real crime was in the choreography of lies. The entire market had learned its lines, but one voice had faltered. Tom. Miss Marple had gone to the church hall under the pretense of donating linens. It was quiet, as expected. The caretaking couple had stepped out for their walk, and there, in the corner beside the folding chairs and hymnals, sat Tom Fletcher, alone, hunched over, hands clasped so tightly that the skin along his knuckles had paled. She did not speak immediately. He noticed her only when she made a gentle sound of her throat clearing. He stood too quickly, knocking a chair. "Miss Marple, sorry, I didn't mean." But she only smiled. "I thought you might appreciate a cup of tea," she said. "It has been a long day." He nodded, but there was no calm in his face, only strain. She sat beside him, her voice quiet. "You've seen something you shouldn't have." A pause. His gaze flicked toward the door, then to the window, then back down at his shoes. "I don't know what you mean." She said nothing. She waited, and then, too quietly to be called confession, but too clear to be ignored, he said, "It was moved." She didn't need to ask. "The sugar bowl?" He nodded. "By whom?" Tom hesitated. I didn't see. I just know it wasn't there in the morning. I clean the stall every day. I wipe it all down. It wasn't there then. Later, after," his voice caught, "after the sudden collapse." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his. "Someone is trying to control the details, rearranging the past to fit a false story." He said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Outside, the bells of the church rang in the hour, 4 o'clock, and somewhere in the market, someone had just committed a second error. Not as visible as poison, nor as final, but there had been a fatal mistake, all the same, because Miss Marple had caught the change. A spoon moved, a bowl returned, a word misspoken. The stage was still standing, the script still followed, but the performance was fraying at the edges. And behind it all, waiting in silence, was the question that no longer slept. Who killed her? There are moments when everything slows, just slightly, not in the way a village pauses for Sunday service, but in the way one might hesitate before opening a long unread letter, or when a curtain stirs where no breeze was expected. That was the hour Miss Marple stepped back into the square and saw the market not for what it pretended to be, but for what it had quietly become. From stall to stall, the same rhythm continued, scales adjusted, coin purses drawn, greetings exchanged, but where once there had been warmth, now there was performance. The greengrocer's smile didn't reach his eyes. The jam seller's apron had been tied too hastily. Even the clink of teaspoons at the tea stand now felt rehearsed. The square had been transformed, turned from a place of comfort into something far more artificial. The routine had become a shield, and shields, Miss Marple knew, are only necessary when there is something to be hidden. She circled once more. On her second pass, she saw it, small, easily overlooked. A crate marked apples, golden russet, had been crossed out and relabeled spices. The handwriting was careful, almost identical to that in the ledger. But it was not the label that caught her attention. It was the position. The crate had moved, and she remembered quite clearly where it had stood the morning Mrs. Thornbury collapsed. She returned home not in haste, but with deliberation. Inside, she fetched the coded entries she had transcribed from the secret ledger. One set of initials matched the ones now visible on the side of that spice crate, HJ, and the date, that very day. The last market day entry recorded, but no spices had been sold, no receipts, only a crate, its contents uninspected. The clue uncovered was no longer abstract. It was sitting in full view of the public, but treated with the kind of studied neglect that only the guilty can perform convincingly. She stepped back into her sitting room and sat down without ceremony. This was no longer just about a teacup or a misplaced sugar bowl. The pattern had grown. A dark conspiracy was no longer a suspicion. It was taking form. Vendors who lied in unison, timelines that flexed to convenience, ledgers written to obscure rather than record, and now crates relabeled to match a version of truth crafted only after the event. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Her mind traced every stall, every word, every flick of a hand or nervous glance. There had been too many identical phrases, too many people repeating words that had not come from their own thoughts. The whispered confession from Tom was no longer the outlier, it was the hinge. The sugar bowl moved, the crate moved, the ledger encoded, and all of it pointed to cold calculation. Someone had rewritten market day, not just this one, but many before it. The village had tolerated it, ignored it, profited from it. But now, with one woman gone and another silenced, the threads had begun to pull apart. There was a price for truth, Miss Marple thought. But there was also a cost to silence, and that debt had just come due. She reached for her notebook, tore a page neatly, and wrote 7 words. It will be market day. Final trap. She folded it, pressed it between the pages of her psalter, and waited, because the next time she returned to the square, she would not be watching from the edges. She would be walking straight into the heart of the performance, with eyes open, questions ready, and the final act about to begin. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Chapter 4. Tom's Confession. The Secret Network. The churchyard, tucked behind St. Luke's and shielded by a row of gently leaning cypress trees, had always offered the kind of privacy no lock could provide. It was quiet, but not forgotten. Worn footpaths, stone benches softened by moss, and names etched in granite, long faded by time and weather. The villagers passed through often, yet rarely lingered, which is precisely why Miss Marple chose it. She had sent no letter, no formal request. She simply stood beside the sundial at 3:15, exactly as she knew she must. And there, on the far bench, shoulders drawn, knees tucked inward like a boy half his age, sat Tom Fletcher. He did not rise when she approached, nor did he speak, but he looked up just once, and the expression in his eyes held no defiance, no irritation, only the weary, haunted look of a man who had held too many secrets for far too long. She sat beside him without comment. Time passed in the way it often does when words are not forced but earned. A pair of sparrows quarrelled in the grass nearby. The bells of the village tolled once, then twice, and then he said softly, "It wasn't supposed to be this." She turned slightly. "No, they said it was just packages, swaps, that's what they called them, little things, passed along, never opened, never asked." Her expression remained unchanged, but her hands folded in her lap. He swallowed. At first it was sweets, then envelopes, then crates, always small, never the same shape twice, but the instructions, they were always exact. Who to give them to, which stall, what day. A gust of wind stirred the edges of his coat. He didn't react. "I didn't think about it," he said. "Not really. It wasn't my job to ask questions. They made that clear." "Who did?" she asked. He hesitated, then looked straight ahead. "The Colonel, and Morrison, but mostly the Colonel." It was always his voice in the instructions, even when someone else passed them along. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her voice even. "And Mrs. Thornbury?" His hands clenched. "She knew, or figured it out. I think she found something. I don't know what." She asked questions, once, quietly. Then she stopped smiling at me. She was frightened. He gave a single sad nod. "She told me to stop coming by so early, that she didn't need help setting up anymore. And your mother?" That was the moment his voice caught. His jaw tensed. He looked away, then back. "She saw the packages once. I thought she hadn't, but she had. She asked if I knew what was inside. I said no. She said I should pray that stayed true." A long silence. "She baked the message," he said. "The one you found." Miss Marple said nothing. She was trying to warn me, but it wasn't enough. There, beneath the ivy-shadowed stones of the churchyard, the truth began to breathe. This was no longer about one poisoned cup or one ledger. It was a smuggling ring, and it ran through the heart of the market. Tom did not speak for some time after that, not because he had nothing more to say, but because he no longer knew how to say it. His mouth worked in silence, as though trying to shape a sentence without finding the thread. Miss Marple waited. Patience in her world had often yielded more than pressure ever could, and today was no exception. "It started properly last spring," he said finally. "At first the packages were just small errands. I thought they were for the Colonel's personal deliveries, favours perhaps for some retired friends. But then I was told not to speak about them, not even to Mum." He looked down at his hands. "And then they paid me." She glanced sideways. "In cash?" she asked. He nodded. "In exact amounts, always folded inside a note, never signed. Once it was inside a copy of the Farmer's Weekly, another time, hidden in a loaf of rye bread." Miss Marple did not smile, but her expression hardened. "Warm bread, cold lies?" she asked gently. "And what did the notes say?" "Just codes, letters, numbers, delivery times, sometimes initials. I didn't understand them, not at first, but I saw them again, in the ledger." He nodded. "That's why I knew it was real, why I had to talk to someone. It's not just money being passed through those stalls. I saw one package dropped beneath a basket of lavender by Mrs. Calthorpe. An hour later, a man with no badge and no business at the market picked it up, then left without buying a thing. Miss Marple sat upright, the weight of the pattern now aligning with detail. A trail of lies indeed, each vendor playing their part, deliveries that never appeared on the books, a system that operated not in the shadows, but within the fabric of the village itself, hidden in plain sight. Tom leaned forward, voice lower now, barely above a whisper. There's a rotation. Every week, different stalls handle different pieces. That's why the ledger matters. It's the only place that shows the whole structure. And who holds the ledger? He gave a sad laugh. Held. Mrs. Thornbury had it. That's why he stopped. That's why they were afraid of her. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And who coordinated it? There was no hesitation. The Colonel. How do you know? Tom's voice broke. Because I heard him. He closed his eyes, struggling now. There was a night, he said, after everyone had gone. I was returning a cart for Mum. I heard voices in the lane behind the bakery. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard him say, if she speaks, she's a liability, and liabilities are dealt with. A long silence hung between them. Only the rustle of leaves filled it. Miss Marple did not move. She let the words settle, like dust. She had feared a single crime, but what stood before her now was a structure designed, maintained, and protected. A dark conspiracy, born not from impulse, but from design. And the one man brave enough to speak of it had done so in a churchyard where the gravestones outnumbered the listeners. The village had been turned into a machine, and someone had just unearthed the blueprint. There are few things as heavy as the knowledge that one's own silence may no longer be enough to keep danger at bay. And as Tom Fletcher sat hunched on that stone bench beneath the quiet trees, the weight of it had finally settled on his shoulders. Not just guilt, but dread. Not just sorrow, but responsibility. Miss Marple remained beside him, her gloved hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed not on him but on the memorial stone opposite. A modest plaque, faded inscription, a woman who died before Tom was born. The ground had taken her gently, the village had moved on, but what the village had allowed to grow since, well, that was another matter entirely. You've spoken the truth, Miss Marple said at last, her voice neither cold nor warm but precise, and that is more than most have dared to do. Tom said nothing. He looked as though he might crumble under the very weight of his own honesty. You must be careful now, she added. He looked up. They already know, don't they? She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes was answer enough. A fatal mistake had already been made, not by Tom, but by the men who had underestimated the value of a frightened young man's conscience. There had been a moment, perhaps many, when the system could have gone on, uninterrupted, when the smuggling ring, tucked so neatly into the rhythm of market day, could have continued passing its parcels and coin, but they had ignored the fault lines. They had believed that fear was stronger than memory, and that was their cold calculation. Tom blinked, his voice fragile. Do you think they'll? She raised a hand. I think they've already noticed your hesitation, and I think if they believe you've spoken, they will act. The air stilled. You must go somewhere safe, she continued. Immediately. Tonight. Where? A cousin. A priest. A stranger, even. Someone not tied to the square. He swallowed. I don't want to run. No, but you may need to disappear. Just for a time. She reached into her bag, retrieved a folded envelope, and handed it to him. In here, she said, is a note addressed to someone in Dorking, a woman who owed me a great favor. She'll take you in without question. Tom stared at it. And what will you do? He asked. Miss Marple's voice softened. I will remain. A pause. Then, I always do. Because Miss Marple was not merely a justice seeker, nor only a village sleuth. She was, by necessity, the one who stayed behind, who waited, watched, listened, and when the time was right, acted. As Tom stood, tucking the envelope into his coat, she did not bid him farewell. She only said, walk slowly, speak to no one, do not return to the square, not yet. He nodded, and then, without another word, he was gone, and as the church bells rang again, Miss Marple remained on the bench, thinking.
She now possessed the confession, the coded secret ledger, the knowledge of who watched whom, and more importantly, what they had all chosen to ignore. There was one name missing, the architect, the one who had designed the movement, mapped the stalls, arranged the lies, and she knew now where to find him. There was one final trap to set, and the silence that surrounded her.
Chapter 5. Second Murder. Mrs. Fletcher's Warning. The sound that brought Miss Marple to her feet that morning was not the postman, nor the clock striking the half-hour, but the sharp, flat knock of knuckles on glass. 3 precise taps. Window, not door, unusual, and deeply unwelcome. The vicar's housekeeper stood on the step, pale, with gloves in one hand, and news she clearly did not wish to deliver. No speech rehearsed, no polite preface. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said, "they say it was the gas line." Miss Marple nodded once, not because she believed it, but because she had heard those words used before, when the truth was inconvenient and people wanted resolution without inquiry. Mrs. Fletcher had not been one to leave stoves unchecked. She was methodical, particular. Her kitchen had the kind of cleanliness that spoke not of fastidiousness, but of habit born from necessity. She wiped down the knobs even before baking. She dried the tea towels in the same order every week, and she never left the gas running. But now the air in the Fletcher home was thick with a faint chemical residue, and the windows stood wide in the wind, as if the house itself wished to forget what it had contained. Miss Marple did not ask to enter. She simply did. The constable on duty offered a nod. He did not stop her. She moved through the quiet space with careful steps, eyes scanning not for what was damaged, but for what remained intact. The kettle on the stove, the apron folded neatly over the chair, and on the counter, unwrapped but fully cooled, a single loaf of bread. It rested on a wire rack beside a butter dish, uncut, ordinary in every visible way. But Miss Marple, the village's quiet intellect, noticed something strange. It had been scored, not the usual slashes for rising, nor the decorative curls Mrs. Fletcher sometimes added when expecting visitors. No, these were letters, faint, as if scratched in haste, but unmistakable once seen. Petton knows all. 4 words, a cryptic message, not unlike the one her son had confessed to fearing. It was not a plea. It was a statement, the kind one leaves not for friends, but for whoever comes next. She did not touch the loaf. She simply leaned closer and read the letters again. The dough had cracked along the edge of the pea, and the crossbar of the tea had softened in baking, but the intent was clear. Mrs. Fletcher had known something, perhaps everything, and now she was gone. Miss Marple straightened. Her eyes wandered to the shelves, neatly arranged tins, recipe books stacked left to right by publication year. No sign of struggle, no breakage, only the absence of life, and one last mother's warning pressed into wheat and yeast. She stepped outside into the daylight, and for the first time in months felt the square was watching her with more than curiosity. It was fear, now, quiet, properly dressed, but unmistakable, and fear in a quiet village is always followed by silence. Miss Marple returned home without ceremony, but not without burden. She carried no parcel, no note, no item of physical consequence, only a memory, 4 words carved into crust, and a growing certainty that the village had crossed a threshold, and there would be no returning to how things had been. She sat at her bureau beneath the window, where the ledgers and receipts of a more innocent age had once been stored. But today she reached for something else, the copy of Mrs. Thornbury's ledger. She had transcribed the entries carefully, retaining even the smallest irregularities in punctuation, capitalization and spacing, because it was not what was written, but how. She traced her finger down a column marked simply WD 7, and paused at an entry she had noted but not fully examined. PETON 15C CT, nothing more, but there it was. A word once thought to be a name was now unmistakably a code. Not a person, at least not directly, a designation, a route perhaps, a protocol. The ledger did not offer clarity, but it whispered intention. P torn. She remembered Tom's words. They said it was just packages. And then after a moment, they told me not to ask. But someone had asked. First Mrs. Thornbury, now Mrs. Fletcher. Both of them had been closer to the stalls than the men behind them realized. Both women had seen more than they were meant to. And both had been silenced, not by chaos, but by control. Miss Marple leaned back and exhaled slowly. The word P-torn had been used to warn, but it had also been used to track. It appeared 4 times in the ledger, never in the same context, always at key junctions, right before shipment days, near vendor names who had since grown quiet, always followed by a trio of initials. This was not smuggling in the casual sense. This was organization. This was a system, and that system had now removed its second obstacle. The second victim was not part of a sequence. She was part of a pattern. Miss Marple made tea, as was her custom when confronting the unacceptable. But even the water in the kettle seemed to boil slower that day, as though it too wished to resist the clarity beginning to form. The market square, once a place of laughter and flour-dusted aprons, had begun to shrink. Not physically, of course, but socially. She had seen it earlier. People who once lingered, now passed each other with nods and not words. Fewer baskets, fewer children, fewer smiles. Fear had done what outrage could not. It had bound the stalls in silence, and silence, Miss Marple knew, was never neutral. It was a choice. The vague alibis, the missing piece in each testimony, the perfectly timed coincidences, all of it now pointed to something very precise. Someone had designed a trade through trust, maintained it through obedience, and now protected it with terror. Mrs. Fletcher had warned her son with flour and crust. She had given her final message, not through speech, but through bread. Bread as resistance, bread as truth. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She now had the message, and she would not forget the name written in it, Petton, because in the village-turned stage, the props had become weapons, and the script was no longer being written by its actors. By the following morning, the village had altered in ways no map could record. Doors closed a little faster, curtains moved a little slower, and the air, not in temperature, but in tone, felt heavier with every unspoken word. They had heard, of course, not through headlines, nor declarations, but through those invisible fibers that connect every home in St. Mary Mead, the butcher who said nothing when he sliced thinner cuts than usual, the florist who adjusted her displays without her usual humming, the milkman who left bottles without pausing to wave. The word was out, but no one said it aloud. Mrs. Fletcher was gone, and with her, the last natural voice of kindness the village had trusted without question. Miss Marple observed all this with her usual detachment, yet even she felt the shift. Market day came again, as it always did, but this time it arrived stripped of colour. The awnings flapped without enthusiasm. The vegetables sat untouched longer than before. People came, yes, but only for what they must. There was no browsing, no lingering, just necessity, and then retreat. She noted the eyes, how they moved, how they didn't. Several vendors refused to look up at all. Mr. Jameson appeared, late, without apology. His hands no longer trembled, but they no longer reached for anything either. He answered no questions, sold little, left early. Tom Fletcher, of course, was nowhere to be seen. And Morrison, present, always present, near the Colonel's table, which now displayed nothing. A table that had once held jars of jam, now offered only a folded cloth and a metal box locked shut. No label, no signage, yet no one asked why. The table was not for commerce now, it was for warning. Miss Marple took her usual walk around the stalls, but this time no one engaged her. No soft inquiries about her roses, no invitations to try the new chutney. Instead, she moved through air that had once been filled with conversation, now choked by restraint. Fear outweighs gossip, that was the final sign. The market had grown silent, not by accident, but by decision. The community turned criminal, was no longer pretending to be whole, it was simply trying to hold. And as she paused near Mrs. Fletcher's now abandoned stall, her eye caught something on the wood. At first glance nothing, just faint scoring where bread loaves had once sat. But upon closer inspection, a mark, a small X, scratched into the far right corner.
It might have been nothing, or it might have been the final piece of Mrs. Fletcher's quiet rebellion. A signal not for Tom, perhaps, but for someone who might come after. Miss Marple stepped back and looked around the square. Every movement now held meaning, every silence weight. She could feel the story folding in upon itself, not finished, no, but closed tight around its secret, as if the village hoped that by ignoring the pattern it might dissolve. But there was no dissolving, only delay, and Miss Marple was done waiting. The message had been baked, the name had been given, the stall had marked itself, and now the game had changed, because there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And the silence wasn't empty, it was watching.
Chapter 6. The Ledger and the Disappearing Vendors. It was beneath the bakery floor that the final proof lay, not in plain sight, of course, and not without resistance, but where truth so often resides in St. Mary Mead, hidden beneath something polished, fragrant, and deceptively innocent. Miss Marple had returned to the stall quietly, long after the last loaves had been cleared away and the cloth pulled back over the counters. She came not with gloves or tools, but with memory. Her eyes traced the edge of the planks, the ones Mrs. Fletcher had once wiped clean each night with vinegar and a quiet song. And just beneath the smallest of them, where the flour dust had settled oddly, she found the sliver of separation. Not new, but used, touched more than once before. She reached down with the edge of her parasol handle, gently prized it free, and heard it, a soft scrape, followed by that unmistakable sound of paper sliding against wood. Inside, a bundle, no more than half an inch thick, bound with twine and folded twice over, pages dense with figures, abbreviations, and marks that only those who'd handled the trade would understand. But Miss Marple understood enough. This was not just a secret ledger, it was a chilling discovery, a record of intent, a document built not to explain, but to command. Week by week, stall by stall, codes for goods, rotations for handlers, initials for recipients, all cross-referenced not by name, but by vendor. There was no guesswork left, only cold calculation. She took it home, locked it in the drawer beside her family Bible, and spent the night translating the marks. It was late, well past tea, when she came to the final page, and there she found it. A final column marked only by 3 strokes, a date, a vendor's code, and the letter X. Each X had something in common. By the end of that week, every vendor marked had vanished. No formal farewells, no sales, no explanation. They were simply gone. The first left before dawn. The second had packed by mid-afternoon. The third disappeared between market days, leaving a stall half-covered, a scale unbalanced, and a trail of whispers that refused to take form. Even Inspector Slack could not deny it now. Miss Marple delivered the ledger to him in person, not as speculation, but as evidence. She said nothing when he opened it, and only nodded when his eyebrows climbed slowly toward his hairline. She had no need to interpret it. The pattern was there, and it was unearthed with each turning page. The ledger had exposed secrets, yes, but more dangerously, it had named roles. Who moved what? Who watched whom? Who knew? And someone had noticed it was missing. Because that same evening, Tom Fletcher's stall was found ransacked, vegetables crushed, signs torn, and one word scratched in uneven strokes across the table's surface: silence or else. It was no longer a warning. It was a violent reaction. Miss Marple closed her curtains that night, not out of habit, but with deliberate intent. For the first time since her arrival in the village so many years ago, she felt what others had described to her again and again. She was being watched. And the silence outside her window. By the morning following Tom's stall's desecration, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had shifted from concerned curiosity to something far less breathable, where each look was weighed, each silence judged, and each shadow carried the outline of guilt or caution. The market square no longer buzzed. It waited. Miss Marple rose early that day. She boiled her water precisely as she always had, left her teapot to steep with its knitted cover, and made her way to the table where the ledger now lay, spread open, lit by the pale morning through lace curtains.
Her fingers traced each coded entry, not for the second time, but for the sixth, cross-checking dates and initials, aligning disappearances with the known vendors, and following the currency of secrets. There it was again, the name she had overlooked, written plainly in the column of notes that ran vertically along the margin, distinct from the rest of the code. Not initials, but a word, always mentioned near transitions, swaps, deliveries, absences. Piton, she now recalled, was used by Tom Fletcher during his confession, but not as a name, as a word spoken quietly, with a kind of weight behind it. A market term, perhaps, a misdirection. She rose, walked to her small bookshelf, and selected the local almanac compiled by the Women's Circle during the war years. Leafing carefully past entries on bake sales and committee minutes, she reached the vendor registry. There, handwritten in the final page, she found it. Piton, a colloquial term adopted by the traders, originally slang for place of passage, but within the margins was a parenthetical note added later by someone observant and careful. Used among inner circle for vendor exchange, implies possession of key parcel or information. So Piton did not name a person, it named a role, a carrier, which meant that whoever had used that word in Mrs. Fletcher's bread warning, Piton knows all, was not identifying a man, but a position, perhaps one passed from hand to hand, market to market, as part of the smuggling ring. And if that warning was real, and not a red herring, then the fatal secret now rested with the current Piton. Whoever they were, they hadn't yet disappeared. Miss Marple placed the almanac gently down, then walked to her window. The village outside remained unmoved, its calm punctuated only by the rare passing cart or whisper of wind through the privet. But beneath that stillness, the danger was no longer distant. She had uncovered a hidden clue, and the reaction at Tom's stall made clear that this clue had not gone unnoticed. She stepped away from the glass and returned to the kitchen, where she folded her scarf into her coat and selected the brooch she always wore when preparing to speak with purpose. It was time, she knew, to pay a second visit to Inspector Slack, not as an observer this time, but as a partner. The line between inquiry and confrontation was narrowing, and although Miss Marple's step remained steady, her thoughts were sharper than ever. Her mind, a scalpel, because if she was right, then the smuggling ring was neither small nor passive. It was watching too, and the trail of lies was growing short. Inspector Slack, though rarely one for subtlety, possessed a working mind when guided by the right hand, and today that hand belonged as ever to Miss Marple. She arrived not as a visitor, but as a bearer of evidence, carrying the ledger within the folds of her shawl, like a relic passed down through generations. No flourish marked her entrance into the small station, only a knock, a nod, and the raising of an eyebrow that invited silence before a single word had passed. She laid the ledger before him, on the polished desk, open to the page marked by a pressed violet from her own garden, symbolic, yes, but also practical. The flower covered the entry for Peton, but revealed just enough to guide the inspector's eye. Slack leaned forward, his face, previously coloured with the usual doubt reserved for Miss Marple's frequent correctness, began to pale as he turned the pages and saw for himself the coded network entries matched with transactions, initials with dates, all structured with the kind of consistency that made excuses untenable. This was no theory, this was no hobby of an inquisitive lady, it was hard evidence. "Miss Marple," he muttered, his voice stalling somewhere between respect and disbelief. She merely nodded, and then came the knock. A constable entered, breathless, his words catching in his throat as he stammered something about the butcher's lane, about the green stall by the baker's corner. Tom's, yes, it had been vandalized again, though this time not with petty scrawl or overturned produce. This time it bore only 3 words, charcoal letters, smeared and urgent, silence or else. Miss Marple closed the ledger with quiet grace and stood. Slack moved quickly, giving orders, dispatching officers, but Miss Marple was no longer listening. Her thoughts had moved beyond this room, beyond the station, back into the narrow alleys of the market square where fear now wore a familiar face. It was clear to her that someone had been watching her work, closely, and if the message on the stall was meant for Tom, it was only because he had spoken. If the ledger had not yet been taken, it was only because they had not known where to look, but now they would. The market square had turned stage, and every vendor left behind played a role either in silence or complicity. That night, several stalls were not opened for the morning trade. One vendor, a man who had once sold soap and whispered about foreign tea roots, had left without notice. Another, who kept watch near the butcher's gate, was said to have packed in haste and vanished under cover of darkness. And the woman from the flower stand, the one with the scar across her wrist, she had not been seen since midday, when she received a folded note and left with her cart still half full. Miss Marple recorded each absence with care. This was no longer merely about Mrs. Thornbury or poor Mrs. Fletcher. This had grown into a dark conspiracy, not because of size or spectacle, but because of reach, of timing, of cold calculation, and now even her own steps felt observed. There was no missing piece, not any more. There was only time, thin, stretched, and fast running out, because now for the first time, Miss Marple was no longer just the village sleuth. She was the final trap, and whether the trap would spring inward or outward, that remained to be seen.
Chapter 7. The Colonel's Involvement. It began, as so many final puzzles do, not with a shout, nor even a whisper, but with rhythm. Miss Marple had noticed it before, of course. The timings, the spacing, the repetition. At first, it could be mistaken for the natural cadence of any market square with long-established traders, where carts rolled in just as the sun struck the chapel's stained glass and folded away neatly before tea. But this was not natural. This was precise. Each stall opened in identical sequence. Each delivery arrived within 3 minutes of the last. Conversations did not meander. They aligned, spoke in rounds, one after another, like actors awaiting cues. The market had become too perfect, and perfection, Miss Marple believed, rarely occurred without choreography. It was when she passed the tobacconist's window, a shop Colonel Hastings visited each Thursday at precisely 11:15, that she paused, not because she'd forgotten her tobacco, but because of the envelope resting behind the pane, misplaced amidst the tins of snuff and matches. Cream paper, military header, but addressed oddly, MC, Stall E, usual time, unusual. By noon, she had borrowed the shopkeeper's trust, and a key detail, that letter was not alone. It was part of a series. Always similar paper, always similar ink. Delivered not by post but by hand. What Miss Marple then deduced was this: Colonel Hastings, long retired from his formal position, had continued to conduct an operation of sorts, one he believed entirely his own. A form of post-war logistics, some might say, or commerce, depending on the listener's tolerance for euphemism. But in truth, it was a smuggling ring. Tea, spices, war relics, foreign perfumes, items brought quietly through dockside routes and redistributed through a clean front, the genteel calm of the St. Mary Mead market. She traced it further. Stall A belonged to Mr. Colthurst, an otherwise mild man, known for his silence and fondness for chess. But Colthurst, it transpired, had once served under Hastings, as had the baker's assistant, and the woman who oversaw poultry stock. Each had a past and a debt. Letters recovered, some folded behind loose bricks, others tucked within cracked library volumes, made it clear Hastings issued orders, and Morrison, his former orderly turned aide-de-camp, executed them without pause. Morrison was not social. He did not attend teas or fete, but he had been seen twice in the past week, once behind Mrs. Fletcher's shop, and once near Tom's cart on the morning of the warning scrawled in charcoal. It was control masked as community, logistics dressed as charity, and Miss Marple now saw the entire stage. The Colonel's obsession with punctuality, his quiet disdain for local disarray, his subtle but firm grip on anything requiring a vote or approval, none of it had been incidental. His reputation for order had simply hidden the pattern, and the pattern was now fully exposed. One does not accuse a colonel without evidence, especially not in a village where memory runs longer than lifelines, and war medals still gleam behind dusty cabinets. But Miss Marple had never been one for blunt accusations. No, her tools were quieter, her observations finer,
and her questions shaped not like arrows, but like lacework, each one connecting until the pattern emerged. She began, as she often did, with questions disguised as compliments. The vicar's wife, who took pride in her biscuits, also took pride in her husband's connection to Colonel Hastings through the local charity board. Over tea, Miss Marple learned that Hastings regularly approved logistics for relief parcels, though oddly, no one could recall receiving such parcels in the last year. When pressed lightly, the vicar's wife merely blinked, confused. "The Colonel handled it," she said. "He always does." A visit to the local hall yielded more. There, locked in a bottom drawer with the emblem of the Home Guard, lay an envelope marked CT Ledgers, Final Routing. It had been forgotten or overlooked. Inside were schedules, not of relief, but of vendor movements, with marked codes aligning to the secret ledger Miss Marple had previously found beneath Tom's stall. The same initials, the same routes, the same rhythm, and one name stood out, handwritten in black: Morrison. Morrison, the man whose hands bore faint bruises, always from woodwork or dog handling. Morrison, who fetched the Colonel's newspaper yet left no footprints when it snowed. Morrison, who spoke rarely but always carried a folded cloth in his coat pocket, the same cloth spotted near the scorched edge of Tom's vandalized stall. It was a trail of lies, carefully woven into the habits of respectability. Miss Marple said nothing for now, only nodded politely, then walked home through the narrow lane past the weaver's cottage, her feet steady, though her thoughts ran like mercury. The Colonel, of course, would not have soiled his own hands. That was not his way. His weapon had been Morrison. His method: silence, obedience, structure. And yet what rattled Miss Marple most was not the breadth of the ring, nor even the brutal betrayal it implied, but the ease with which it had gone unnoticed. For years Hastings had operated beneath the veil of civility. His network ran through smiles and shared glances, a dark conspiracy that grew not in shadow, but in routine. It was a chilling discovery. And it told Miss Marple one thing quite clearly: he would not stop, which meant that if he believed she knew, he would be ready. She reached her door and paused before the latch. Her fingers did not tremble, her mind remained fixed. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. But first she must outplay a soldier who had built his life on moves made 10 paces ahead, and Hastings, she now knew, played chess not for leisure, but for conquest. The next morning brought a windless stillness to St. Mary Mead, that strange kind of hush which carries more weight than silence. The market stalls opened later than usual. No one asked why. No one needed to. Miss Marple, wrapped in a faded shawl of unremarkable wool, made her way through the square as she always did, slightly slower than the younger women, yet always with direction. Her eyes flicked not from person to person but from behavior to behavior. Mr. Colthurst's shoes had mud from a location he hadn't named. Mrs. Drew, who never smoked, now carried matches in her apron. Tiny fragments, yes, but in Miss Marple's world, nothing escaped her. At exactly 9:10, the Colonel stepped into the bakery, right on time, requesting as always the usual. No one questioned that his usual had changed. Few noticed he no longer made eye contact. But Miss Marple did, and she noticed something else. The newspaper folded beneath his arm had already been read. The creases were wrong. He was feigning routine now, holding the shape of a man, not the substance. She waited. At midday she took tea with Inspector Slack. It was not an act of desperation, nor even alliance, but of timing. She brought with her the partial ledger, 3 letters from the charity drawer, and a list, a very short one, 3 names. "Take these," she said simply, "but say nothing, not yet. One of them will notice, and that's the one we want." Slack, to his credit, said nothing either. But when she left, his gaze remained fixed for longer than usual. By nightfall, the village felt more like a stage set than a place of residence. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Movements were precise, too precise, and somewhere between the allotment and the church steps, Tom Fletcher had vanished. Only his cart remained. The canvas had been slashed, the sugar bowl tipped sideways, and scrawled in thick black chalk across the stall's front board were the words, "We warned you." Miss Marple arrived alone. She touched the bowl first, then the chalk, and finally the note slipped beneath a cracked jar of marmalade. It was short, 2 words, but enough. She knows. That night, in her drawing room, she did not light the fire. She simply opened her notebook and wrote 3 entries. 1. Final trap. 2. Pet and decode. 3. Morrison watches windows. She folded the page, placed it beneath her teacup, and waited. Because now, for the first time, the hunter had noticed the sleuth, and the village, once warm and sweet with gossip and scones, had turned sharp, cool, and taut with tension. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching.
Chapter 8. The Final Trap. Market Day Showdown. It began with the return of routine. A Sunday evening, mild and muffled. The kind of quiet that one might mistake for peace. But Miss Marple knew better. In her world, true peace did not return so easily, especially not to St. Mary. At precisely 6:15, the final move was set in motion, elegant, deliberate, and just shy of obvious. A note slipped beneath a stall's fruit crate, a whisper to the baker's apprentice, a message delivered through silence. Tomorrow, the market would open as usual, and Tom Fletcher would be there. So too Miss Marple. The next morning broke without ceremony. No announcement, no urgency. But those who paid attention, really paid attention, sensed something was wrong. Or rather, something was waiting. By 9:30, the square had resumed its role, stalls in place, the scent of fresh bread drifting lightly through lanes polished by footfall. Apples gleamed, jars were stacked, and yet too many eyes watched from behind net curtains. Too few hands reached for the baskets. At the center of it all stood Tom, rigid, pale, pretending at normalcy. His hands, usually in motion, now rested on the counter's edge as if anchoring him to the earth. Miss Marple stood across from him, a shawl draped, eyes clear, a quiet exchange, 3 sentences, no more, enough to summon what needed summoning. The colonel arrived just before 10. He walked slowly. Morrison flanked him, 1 pace behind. No uniforms, no weapons, just presence. But it was presence laced with intent. They did not speak. They didn't need to, for in a village such as this, threats wore manners. Violence came softly. The colonel nodded to Tom, then to Miss Marple. Her response? A simple gesture, adjusting her brooch, and so the moment settled. Waited. Miss Marple, the colonel began, the edge in his voice veiled beneath familiarity. I do wish you'd reconsider this interference. You are, after all, a woman of your age. This kind of business, well, it invites consequences. Consequences are not always imposed, Colonel, she replied gently. Sometimes they are earned. The stillness tightened. Morrison stepped forward too close. A shadow fell across the stall. Tom flinched, but Miss Marple held her ground. She looked not at the colonel, nor at Morrison, but at a single spot over the colonel's shoulder between the chimney and the clock tower. The signal had been seen. A pause, a breath, a heartbeat longer, and then what followed took only seconds. Yet in the space between Morrison's advance and the final word spoken, a century's worth of order fractured. Villagers had gathered, but discreetly. A door left ajar. A curtain stirred. The baker's boy lingered with no tray in his hand. The postmistress stepped out without a letter to deliver. They were waiting. Inspector Slack stood hidden behind the old tobacconist's shutter, his boots coated in flour to avoid sound. 3 constables, no more, positioned behind crates and barrows, silent, alert. This was not a show of force. It was a measure of trust. Miss Marple, with one hand still resting on her handbag, tilted her head slightly. Morrison froze mid-step. The colonel turned too late. Now, she said, only that. And everything changed. From behind the butcher's stall came a flurry of movement. Slack emerged first, voice firm but quiet. Colonel Hastings, you'll come with us. No raised tones, no handcuffs yet, just the weight of inevitability. The colonel did not speak at once. Instead, he turned to Morrison, eyes narrow, calculating. But Morrison had already stepped back, his hands half raised, unsure now whom to protect. The colonel's precision, the military order he so treasured, wavered. "You've made a mistake," the colonel muttered. "I've made many," said Miss Marple, softly, "but this isn't one of them." A hush swept across the square. Not silence, hush, that particular stillness where expectation holds its breath. Tom's gaze darted to the constables, then to his mother's stall, where once there had been bread and quiet comfort. His hands trembled, but Miss Marple touched his wrist, briefly. The gesture steadied him. Slack stepped forward, now with paper in hand. "We have evidence of payments made to your estate, several vendors, multiple dates, and the ledger, well, it reads quite clearly once you know what you're looking for." "Allegations," the colonel snapped. "Not anymore," Slack answered, producing 2 envelopes now unsealed. "We've had eyes on Morrison's cottage. Letters, code lists, even the same phrases used by Mrs. Fletcher before her accident." There was movement now, among the crowd, subtle nods. A man stepped forward from the greengrocer's booth. Then a second, the cheese merchant. These were not declarations, they were acknowledgements. The village had known something, now it knew more. Miss Marple observed, not victorious but resolute. She had always known this would not be a spectacle. Justice, she believed, never roared. It whispered. As the colonel was led away, the church bell struck once. A boy dropped a jug, and still no one spoke. The trap had closed, but what it truly caught, that remained to be seen. By midday, the market resumed, not with joy, nor triumph, but with the kind of tentative rhythm one sees after a long silence. Baskets were lifted, coin trays reopened, and polite conversation was exchanged, though with fewer eyes meeting and more glances cast behind shoulders. The colonel had left in a car with no ceremony. Morrison followed in the back of a constable's van. Neither resisted, neither confessed. They did not need to. The ledger had spoken. The vendors, those who remained, would do the rest. And yet even with arrests made, secrets exposed, and the air momentarily cleared of fear, Miss Marple did not smile. She remained seated at the bench near the square's edge, her gloved hands folded over her handbag, eyes on the bakery stall. No words passed her lips, but her thoughts moved swiftly, quietly, like threads stitching a fabric only she could see. There had been no second explosion of drama, no dramatic shout of guilt or righteous indignation. That was not the village's way, but something had changed. A seam had split, and beneath it, something raw had been glimpsed. The smuggling ring was only part of it. That much she knew now. The coded ledger, the pattern of payments, the sudden collapse of Mrs. Thornbury, the whisper in the bread, these had built the frame. But something, some detail, remained just outside reach. She considered the cryptic message baked into Mrs. Fletcher's final loaf. Peyton knows all. Peyton, she had learned, was not a person. It was a term, a code used by the vendors to refer to shipments of high value. Imported goods rerouted through St. Mary Mead, moved beneath crates of fruit or sacks of flour. But what had Mrs. Fletcher meant? Had she discovered more than smuggling? A second victim, yes, but what if she had also uncovered a fatal mistake? Marple's eyes drifted to Tom. He was restocking crates now, shoulders low, as if a weight had been removed and another added in its place. He was safe, but haunted. Fear still lingered in him, not for himself, but for the damage done. Rage had come and gone. What remained was guilt. Miss Marple knew that guilt carried its own scent, not the sharp trace of almonds like cyanide, but something far heavier. It lingered in gestures, in hesitation, in the absence of denial. And so, as the day drew to a close, she rose quietly, walking the square one last time. Her eyes flicked to each stall, each alley, each corner where shadows might gather. A phrase echoed gently in her mind. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. She would find it, before justice faded beneath politeness once more. And to those still watching, still wondering, where are you watching from? And what do you believe justice should look like in a village like this? Chapter 9. Justice restored. Justice in St Mary Mead did not arrive with fanfare or declaration. It came, rather as one might expect from a village so rehearsed in the art of politeness, understated, orderly, and almost invisible to those who were not watching closely. The trial of Colonel Hastings was brief by judicial standards, yet exhaustive in the eyes of those who had lived beneath his shadow for years. His correspondence, unearthed through both Inspector Slack's warrant and Miss Marple's discretion, laid bare a map of profit, silence, and deadly deception. The coded records, the threatening notes, the secret ledger beneath the butcher's floor. The court needed little more. He was convicted on all major charges. Morrison, ever the quieter hand, was given less. His guilt, while substantial, was weighted down by fear and manipulation, the defense argued. Still, it was enough. A sentence served, a name stained. The vendors told a more complicated story. Those who had turned a blind eye were warned, those who had profited were fined, and those who had tried in small ways to warn others, Mrs. Fletcher among them, were remembered not with flowers but with pause. The stallholders spoke less in the weeks that followed. The energy of market day dimmed, though it did not disappear. Small towns, after all, are made of resilience and routine. Tom's part was not forgotten. His whispered confession, his broken courage, and above all, his decision to speak, despite threat, shame, and the memory of his mother's quiet strength, earned him leniency. He did not escape public scrutiny, but he was not condemned. Miss Marple had spoken for him, and her word, in St Mary Mead, was worth more than most judgments. The market began, gradually, to recover, not as it had been, but something like it. Bread was baked again, stalls reopened. Gossip, once idle, became cautious, and amid it all, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The roses had survived, but the soil remembered. In the weeks that followed, St Mary Mead wore its relief like a coat left out in the rain, draped but damp. Life resumed, yes, but never quite untouched, and perhaps that was the proper way of it. The village square no longer echoed with urgent whispers, but with the quiet return of rhythm. The baker's daughter swept the steps each morning. Miss Penrose resumed his coughing argument with the fishmonger. The price of lemons rose slightly, and someone wrote a strongly worded note about it on the post office bulletin board. These were signs, not of amnesia, but of persistence. Miss Marple walked more slowly now, not from age but from observation. She noticed the absences. Mrs. Fletcher's kitchen remained locked. The Colonel's estate was overgrown. 2 stalls never reopened. And yet, amidst those silences, were signs of restoration. Tom planting herbs beside his cart, children no longer pulled away by anxious mothers, and the unmistakable aroma of warm bread drifting into Sunday air. Gratitude came not in words, but in gestures. A nod from a once suspicious greengrocer, a fresh bloom placed by her garden gate, a quiet cup of tea poured without request at the vicar's fundraiser. No one asked Miss Marple what she truly felt, but had they done so, she might have replied with something simple: balance. For justice, in her mind, was never spectacle, it was quiet correction, a shift back to centre, and yet even she knew that some truths left marks. The fatal secret at the heart of the smuggling ring had reached further than anyone first believed, not only in goods or money, but in trust. Some neighbours still looked over their shoulders, others averted their eyes entirely. The shadow of suspicion, once lifted, had left behind a faint but stubborn outline. Still, the English countryside has always been good at healing without boasting. Flowers bloomed again, the market turned its wheels once more, and Miss Marple, she returned to her books, her begonias, and the unspoken understanding that quiet minds are never truly at rest. There are conclusions that sound like applause, loud, final, indisputable, and then there are endings such as this, quiet, careful, shaped by memory rather than judgment. Miss Marple had never sought the limelight, nor did she care much for it now. Her satisfaction lay not in the spectacle of arrests or headlines, but in the realignment of truth. The restoration of peace, however delicate. The Colonel's conviction sent tremors beyond the courtroom.
Old allies were quietly disavowed, his medals were removed from the village hall, his portrait taken down. Not from vengeance, but because the image no longer matched the man. There were those who asked, "Who killed her?" in reference to Mrs. Fletcher, but those closest to Miss Marple knew she never answered such questions with a single name. There had been a smuggling ring, yes, there had been threats, and there had been one woman with flour on her hands and defiance in her heart. It was the fatal mistake of someone, perhaps several, who mistook silence for safety. The secret ledger, the cryptic messages, the trail of lies, these had now been exposed. Yet what Miss Marple found most haunting was not what had been unearthed, but what had remained, the quiet intellect of a village that had observed too much, said too little, and learned perhaps too late, that small deeds matter. She never spoke again of the chilling discovery in Fletcher's oven. She never told the vicar how close Tom had come to ruin. And when the reporter from London arrived asking about heroism, she politely declined the interview, offering instead a scone and a weather update. There was one final message, however, she allowed herself to receive, written in the neatest script, left in an envelope without a name, and tucked under her gate latch: "For justice, and for your roses, thank you." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was watching. And to those of you still watching now, wherever you are, tell me, in your corner of the world, what does justice look like? And who, if not us, will carry it forward?
Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Reflections. It began with bells. Not the hurried chimes of alarm or the resounding clang of triumph, but the solemn, measured toll of memory. St. Mary Mead's churchyard, washed in the pale morning hush, stood host to two small memorials. Modest stones, side by side, one bearing the name of Mrs. Thornbury, the other etched simply with Fletcher. The villagers gathered not out of obligation, but from something older than law, a need to mark the passage of those who had stood among them, sold them bread, warned them in whispers, or merely listened. The Reverend kept his words brief. The faces in the pews stayed lowered, and in the back, as ever, sat Miss Marple, gloved, still, her hat tilted just so beneath the stained glass of St. Catherine's window. She did not cry. Tears had come earlier, in private, over a cup of tea, or while folding linens. But not here. Here, she listened, and she remembered. It was after the service, when the mourners had thinned into polite dispersal, and the larks above resumed their murmured debates, that Miss Marple found herself by the edge of her garden once again. Her roses, cut back sharply that spring, had returned, as roses do, not with fury, but with silent persistence. A bloom here, another shyly behind it, soft, stubborn, enduring. And as she trimmed the stems, she thought not of weapons or codes or the fatal secret embedded in a loaf of bread, but of the quietness of evil and the quieter strength that had stood against it. The smuggling ring, the deadly deception, the trail of lies, all of it had masqueraded as something harmless, helpful even. That, she reflected, was always the risk in a place where manners were currency and gossip wore lace gloves. Evil, she mused, did not always raise its voice, but then again neither did goodness, and perhaps that was the greater truth. She moved slowly along the rosebed, hands dirtied by work more ancient than crime, the pruning of what no longer served, and the coaxing forth of new life. A quiet intellect, yes, but one not bound to parlours and parlance alone. There was justice in the garden, if one knew how to see it, in roots that held firm through storms, in petals that defied cold mornings without complaint. No journalists came knocking, no medals were handed out, but Miss Marple had always measured success not in headlines, but in the hush that followed them. The village had exhaled, and in that breath, long denied and softly earned, was restoration. Tom, still young enough to carry regret, and old enough to change, had returned to help his mother tend their stall. There were no more cryptic messages, no more threats scribbled in red. He spoke little of the past, and Marple asked less. But she watched him, and in the way he swept the stones before laying down crates, or in the way he glanced twice at strangers, she saw penance. Several vendors had simply vanished, gone in the night, their carts abandoned, their names muttered only when ale loosened the tongue. Some had been questioned, one detained quietly in Bexhill after a whispered confession, but others had melted away, as those in the shadows often do. The shadow of suspicion, however, lingered, not over one stall, but across all, and yet the market reopened. The ledger had been given to Inspector Slack, its codes deciphered, its secrets exposed. There was rage, to be sure, among those who felt betrayed, those who feared implication, but there had also been silence, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the loudest sound of all. Silence baked in. What remained was something gentler, though never soft, a kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from enduring. She had always said the English countryside was the last defence against chaos, but now she knew better. It was not the fields, nor the hedgerows, nor even the tea shops. It was the people, the ones who stayed, the ones who remembered. It was during a mid-morning stroll, basket in hand, that Miss Marple crossed the square once more. The stalls had begun to fill again, not quite as full as before, not as loud perhaps, but there, jam jars gleamed in sunlight, plums lined up like soldiers, and rolls of linen stirred gently in the breeze. Conversations, once guarded, found new breath as laughter returned to its rightful place between stalls. Not bold, but real. She passed the bakery, under new ownership now, and nodded toward the girl dusting the front window. The scent of bread floated gently into the lane. No almonds today, just rye, a symbol of sustenance without secrets. A few villagers raised hats or murmured greetings as she walked. They did not stop her with flattery or press for details. They knew better. Some truths were not for retelling, not yet, but their eyes said enough. A look of gratitude, a shared understanding, a weight lifted. Miss Marple paused beneath the war memorial. The names carved there had watched this story unfold in silence, some of the very names she had seen repeated in the secret ledger. She studied the list with her usual care, never one to hurry grief or justice. Both, she knew, aged slowly. She turned toward the church gardens then, her eyes resting briefly on the roses she had helped replant, the ones from Mrs. Thornbury's garden. They were beginning again, without fuss, without permission, and as she stepped onward, the faintest breeze catching the edge of her sleeve, the thought came, not sharp, but sure: the market will open again, and this time, the truth will walk freely among the stalls. Thank you for staying through every clue, every whispered confession, every moment the silence seemed to watch. If you've come this far, tell me, where are you watching from, and what do you believe truly restores justice when a community is torn apart? The village has spoken, but the conversation has only just begun.